Good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin Tucker. I'm the Chief Curator with the High Museum of Art, and I'd like to welcome you all tonight for a talk where our speaker will offer us an in-depth look at the exhibition Virgil Abloh, Figures of Speech, and the fascinating designer behind the project. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special thank you to all of our exhibition sponsors that made this project possible and its presentation here at the High, as well as to our many High Museum of Art members, including those with us here tonight. So thank you all. Your support is invaluable and makes excellent projects and exhibitions like this possible for us. I would also like to take a moment to remind you that after the talk, the exhibition galleries will be open until 9 p.m. Now I'm delighted to introduce to you and to welcome Michael Darling. Michael Darling is the James W. Alsdorf Chief Curator with the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and the organizing curator of Virgil Abloh, Figures of Speech. During his time at MCA, Darling organized Takahashi Murakami, The Octopus Eats His Own Leg, which was the highest attended exhibition in the MCA's 50-year history. He's also been responsible for the stewardship of a number of major projects of contemporary art and design during his tenure there. Previously, Darling was the John and Mary Shirley Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Seattle Art Museum and Associate Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. He received his BA in Art History from Stanford University and his MA and PhD in Art and Architectural History from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Darling frequently serves as a panelist, lecturer, and guest curator on contemporary art and architecture. So we're thrilled to have him here with us tonight to give us some unique perspectives on the development of this fantastic exhibition and the man who is Virgil Abloh. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our special guest and speaker tonight, Michael Darling.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. It's really been a pleasure working on this exhibition with our colleagues here at the High, and it's been fantastic to see this show here and to understand that it's been getting such great response from the Atlanta audiences. I wanted to just start a little bit by talking about Virgil himself. One of the things that drew me to this project was the fact that Virgil, we're in Chicago, of course. Virgil lives and works in Chicago, and really his formative years were based in Chicago. He grew up I think I was caught out calling it a suburb the last time I was here in Atlanta. It's a town called Rockford that's quite a ways outside of Chicago, but greater Chicago area, northern Illinois at least. The son of Ghanaian immigrants, and he lived a very suburban American life up there in Rockford, and he was a skateboarder and a BMX rider, and he was listening to, I think we've lost our image again, listening to, Guns N' Roses and hip hop and all kinds of just very American things. I have it on my screen, but you don't have it up there. So I was really fascinated by this, very generic upbringing for somebody that also was probably one of the very few black kids kind of in his neighborhood, and also somebody that eventually then went to the University of Wisconsin to study engineering, which was a classic kind of first-generation immigrant story where his dad said, "You've got to go get a degree for something where you can actually make a living and not something kind of weird like art or art history or something like that." I'm going to take a look at this. And so he studied engineering at the University of Wisconsin, but was always, through that whole period, interested in fashion, interested in music, interested in subcultures like skateboarding, and was DJing at dorm parties and things like that. And eventually, near the end of his term, he really found art. And thought that and he also thought maybe architecture would be a way to combine his art interests with his more technical engineering type education. And so he came back to Chicago and went to the Illinois Institute of Technology, and I'll show you images later of what that building looked like. And started working as an architect. And so this whole story, this biography, to me was really fascinating, because the thing that really made Virgil's name was his work in fashion, but the fact that he had this engineering degree, this architecture degree, was the son of Ghanaian immigrants, was just a really amazing story, I thought, and really separated him from other people. Not to mention, I thought that the work that he was doing at that time, when we started our conversations back in 2016, was really interesting. Adding to that story, however, while he was starting to finish up his work at IIT, where he got his master's in architecture, he was very interested in hip hop. He was DJing in underground places and found out that Kanye West's creative team were printing a lot of their T-shirts and concert merchandise in Chicago. So he was able to slip some of his own T-shirt designs under the noses of the folks at this T-shirt shop, and Kanye's people called him. And he eventually joined Kanye's circle of creative advisors, started working with Kanye on concert merchandise and concert designs using his architecture background, and really apprenticed with Kanye for almost 10 years. And one of the things that was, and this is a picture of Virgil on the far right with Kanye and some of his other friends. They sort of crashed lots of fashion shows in Paris in 2008. And I think this is one of the things that's really fascinating about how Virgil's own fashion career has developed, because he was sitting there literally on the outskirts of this group. And in fact, even when South Park made a parody of Kanye and his squad, Virgil didn't even make the cut in the cartoon version. And for those of you that are South Park fans, this is the famous Fish Sticks episode. But Virgil was quietly on the sidelines as Kanye's consigliere, watching Kanye try all these different experiments, and in many cases fail at ways of really breaking into the fashion world. Around in 2009, Kanye launched his first iteration of the Yeezy shoe, but it was with Nike, and Virgil was sitting there at his side watching how Nike wouldn't give Kanye more creative input and expand the line, and Kanye eventually left and went to Adidas soon thereafter. In 2009, Virgil and Kanye went to Rome and did an internship at Fendi. And then also during this whole period, Kanye had this whole fashion brand called Pastel that he was working on. But he was such a perfectionist that it never really made it out into the world. So Virgil was sort of watching all this and logging it. And he's for those of you that have met him, he's a very quiet, methodical, humble guy. And you can just tell that he was absorbing this material and would eventually apply it to his own work. And I think one of the things that he saw too, he saw how Kanye's maybe more boisterous, rambunctious style wasn't always working, and Virgil has kind of the opposite, a really kind of quiet, diplomatic kind of way of pushing his agenda forward. And then one of the things also that I think he got from this period is really recognizing some of the systemic racist barriers that are in the fashion industry that was so dominated by white culture, and wanted to figure out how to kind of crack that code in a way. And there's a famous episode in this whole story. In 2013, Kanye was on a radio show with this DJ called Sway, and Sway was kind of asking him, like, well, what's going on with your fashion? And this was the same time period where Kanye was already starting to have trouble with Nike. And Kanye ended up kind of going on a rant, and this DJ really had his hands full and was like trying to calm him down and everything. But Kanye was really just going crazy, and it turned into some memes even, because sway really felt like, you're Kanye West, you can just go out and start your own fashion line. But really, Kanye recognized how difficult it was to break into the fashion world and do it right, and to really make a statement, really make waves in this industry. And so, even though Virgil's not so keen on memes, I really was interested in not only the fact that this became kind of a meme-worthy moment, but I think really was a turning point in Virgil's, or kind of emblematized what Virgil also recognized in the industry himself, and what he would eventually apply to breaking into the industry. For Virgil, one of the things he texted me right after he got the nod for to be the menswear designer for Louis Vuitton, and he said, it all started with a T-shirt. And I think this is one of the great messages of Virgil's own story, and even of the exhibition that we're trying to tell, is that, to become, at the top of the fashion field, you just kind of have to go out there and do it. And in Virgil's case, T-shirts really became not only an easy way in, it's a pretty low barrier of entry, but it also kind of connects up with the skateboarding culture and the streetwear culture that he came up with. And so even early on in 2008 here, he was still doing his early work with Kanye, was just out of architecture school, and he was able to make a T-shirt for this very famous Parisian boutique called Colette. And so this was one of the very first T-shirt designs that he made and put into circulation. He kept kind of playing around with the power of T-shirts and this sort of ethos of streetwear and street culture. And in 2012, he and a bunch of other guys that were part of the Kanye West creative team were holed up in London, and they were working on some videos that were related to Kanye's Cruel Summer album. And at night, they would go out to different clubs in London, and they would say, hey, we're with Kanye, he's gonna come by a little bit later, can you let us on to the turntables and we can DJ a little bit and get the place warmed up before he came? And they would let them do this. And so this is Virgil in the red shirt there, and he and this group, they kind of called them, they kind of saw themselves almost like a boy band, although there was one woman in the group, and so they called themselves Bin Trill. And you can see Virgil's wearing one of the shirts here. Here's some other versions of it too, but they even made little names for themselves, and it was all just like using the T-shirts almost as like a uniform in a way. And eventually the group, or the brand Hood by Air, you can see here, got involved, and they started to sponsor some of these shirts and would carry them, and some famous rappers started wearing these shirts. This was a version that Virgil and the group did for the rapper Travis Scott, also still within this Bin Trill kind of identity. And also at this time too, the Kanye's group, they were all based in the Lower East Side of New York, and it was a really amazing group of people, that a lot of whom have also gone on to make their own fashion labels now that have become quite influential, like Samuel Ross and Matthew Williams and Heron Preston and people like that. But Virgil really got close with the head designer from Hood by Air, whose name was Shane Oliver. And so in the exhibition upstairs, you'll see some of the designs that Virgil made for Hood by Air. And it was a really influential underground label. It's kind of stopped and started a few times, was always meant to be kind of just for the underground in a way, club kids, queer kids, kids of color. And so Virgil really was attracted to that. And you can see here in the middle where the Bin Trill kind of logo mixes with the Hood by Air logo, and where on the far right side you see what Virgil was doing, where he's printing on all kind of surfaces of these T-shirts and really pushing the idea of silk screening to kind of new heights. And so I've been kind of trying to pay attention to see whether or not the exhibition in the book, which talks about this stuff, has kind of increased the desirability and value of this Hood by Air stuff. But I think it's still a little bit under the radar. For those of you that are looking for investment possibilities. And eventually, during this time period, there was lots of these little experiments like this, where Virgil, I think, was just kind of testing the waters, figuring out what was the culture was responding to, where he could kind of contribute in a way, and still almost kind of baby steps. And eventually, he kind of went out on his own kind of full bore in 2012 with a brand that he called Pyrex Vision. And I don't even think he meant it to be a brand at first. And in fact, it only really lasted 1 year. But he had the simple idea of taking T-shirts, mostly like Champion sweatshirts, T-shirts, shorts, and also it's kind of dead stock Ralph Lauren flannel plaid shirts, and he just printed on the back of them Pyrex and 23. And in some cases, you'll see he also printed images of Caravaggio paintings on there too, which I'll talk about in a minute. But in this brand, Pyrex Vision, there was some social commentary. He was kind of talking about the cliche of the only way that black kids can get out of the ghetto is either if they're drug dealers, meaning where the Pyrex comes in and making drugs in kind of homemade drug labs, or to be Michael Jordan, who wore the number 23. So it was a kind of a pointed comment. It wasn't something that was made to last forever. And one of the things that he made for this brand, in a way, was this video that he called A Team with No Sport. And this is on view in the exhibition upstairs. A lot of the kids that are in this video have also gone on to become quite influential. Some of them were part of the ASAP mob, which are influential hip-hop artists and fashion designers and other people that are part of this group. So it was just, again, this package kind of statement that Virgil came up with. And here are some of the other variations on these Pyrex items. Interestingly, you know, like I said, it stopped after a year, and in some ways I think maybe the idea itself kind of was limited and didn't have the legs to keep going on. On the other hand, he also was stealing somebody's trademarked name of Pyrex, and so there probably were some cease and desist letters in the mix there too. But interestingly, and this is something that plagues Virgil a lot, there also are copyright pirates out there in the world. And Virgil, even though he invented this, he put this out into the world, he can't even use this anymore because other people have kind of gone in and sort of taken over these copyrights, especially people in Italy and Spain and Portugal. I think there's a lot of kind of copyright piracy kind of going on over there. And so he can't even use this material without finding other ways of kind of archivally documenting it. But interestingly, too, with this Pyrex work, like I mentioned on the right-hand side, you see this hoodie with an image of a Caravaggio painting, and it's the Deposition of Christ. And at the University of Wisconsin, Virgil finally, after he got through all of his engineering classes, took an art history class, and he was blown away by Caravaggio and some of the ideas of chiaroscuro and these other techniques that Caravaggio helped to pioneer and really change the course of art history. So from this point on, he starts to slip in art historical references into his clothes, which also I think has been really interesting to see how kids that might think that they're more interested in skateboarding and hip hop and things are actually kind of also broadcasting an interest in fine art and art that's, you know, in this case, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years old. And so that's also become a real technique, I think, of Virgil's work over the years. And even now, for those of you that follow him on Instagram, lately he's been doing this kind of subset of postings that are art historical references. And there's one recently of Calder in his studio, and all kinds of well-known designers from the 20th century, like furniture designers and architects. And so I think he's really unique in that way in pushing these art historical references into his fashion work, and then we all go out there and wear them in the world and kind of keep art alive in a way. So after Pyrex, which, as I said, lasted only about a year in 2012, he decided that, okay, I think I know how to do this. I watched what Kanye was doing. He met people through the Kanye period that were in the Italian fashion industry that knew the manufacturing side, knew the marketing side, knew how to get on the fashion calendar. And so he started a brand called OffWhite. And one of the things that I really wanted to get through in the exhibition, which I've kind of alluded to already, is this pretty insistent critique of institutional racism that's at the heart of Virgil's work. I said it's more subtle than maybe somebody like Kanye, but it's always been there in the work. And even the word off-white itself suggests a decentering from the dominant white culture of the fashion world, but even maybe one can pretty easily argue of Western culture itself. But then the term itself, though, is also kind of bland and kind of neutral. Off-white is sort of a boring color, but there's this real subtle but I think important political move in that term that's really important that I think most people aren't really paying attention to. The thing that also I think is really interesting about Off-White is Virgil finally started to let his architectural training come into the work, especially his love of cities and urbanism and urban design. So I've shown you some images here where you see even the striping on a crosswalk makes its way into the motifs that he uses in his clothes. And you see this diagonal striping on the woman's jacket and on this hoodie from his very first men's collection. Directional signage also that you find in cities or in airports like you see here from Glasgow make it into his work. Industrial materials like big nylon tie-down belts that you might find on the back of a truck to hold loads down, and the belts that kind of hold those things together. The famous sort of zip tie tags that he puts on his shoes, which also are typically used to kind of make sure that some parcel or something is secure and hasn't been tampered with. So lots of these materials that are in the worlds of construction, of urbanism, architecture, make their way into his work. And I think this is, again, where you start to see his fashion sensibility, his interest in cities and architecture start to really come together. And you can see here, too, on this slide with the purse, where even this diagonal directional signage motif really becomes a decorative element and a piece of jewelry almost. The world of art also continues to influence him. This is just one example where a whole fashion collection that was called You Cut Me Off was very inspired by Lucio Fontana, who was famous for slashing his canvases. And Virgil borrowed some of the graphics and language from some of Fontana's early exhibition announcements for this collection. You can see jackets like sliced down the middle like this Nebraska logo that's only partially visible, or it's maybe a little hard to see with this yellow overcoat, but there also are sort of slashed passages of canvas attached to that. And also even the bag that he's carrying has this sort of slashed canvases. So you see these art historical references in Virgil's work all the time, but also punning and plays of words. So You Cut Me Off also is kind of a road rage kind of reaction or statement. And he also told me that at the time he was interested in how some of the European fashion designers were starting to kind of dip into the world of streetwear and starting to make kind of crazy sneakers and other things and putting them into their fashion collections, when Virgil saw that as kind of an American thing and something that he and his peers in a way really had been doing. So he was talking about these guys cutting him off and kind of getting in his lane. So there's always lots of wordplay going on in Virgil's work that I think also makes it really fun, and especially for an art historian to kind of unpack, which I think also made this show difficult, because every one of these collections that he would do in menswear, women's wear are so full of references that it would be great to do in a book or something, but it's really hard when you need 10 mannequins and all these clothing to just talk about one collection when he's done, at this point, it's probably 50 collections or something. So it's a really challenging, something that I learned, this being my first show, having to do with fashion, is sort of telling these deeper stories that really are embedded in all these garments that designers like Virgil makes. One of the other things that I really like about how he created his off-white collections is that he often would really take a theme, one very concise kind of theme, and kind of play it out through the garments themselves. In this case, which is a collection called Mirror, Mirror, he kind of imagined a fictional rock band, kind of an upstart rock band, and made clothes that maybe this fictional band would wear, including the guy on the far left looks like he's got record albums under his under his arm that he's maybe going to kind of distribute to different, A&R guys or radio stations or something, and kind of ripped and torn clothes that of course are made really beautifully and carefully, and just sort of trying to tap into that teenage rebellious spirit of rock and roll in this collection. And I think that's another thing that I find a lot in Virgil's work, and he's mentioned this too, especially with OffWhite. He really likes to try to tap into his 17-year-old self. He's kind of talked about that. So that, again, sense of rebelliousness, of youth, of possibility, of not caring about the rules. And so you find that a lot in his work with OffWhite. And conversely, he's kind of said that maybe now that he's got Louis Vuitton to play with, that's maybe more his, I guess he's 40 years old now. That's his kind of 40-year-old self at work. And still OffWhite becomes the channel for this more youthful kind of energy. I just wanted to also show this slide too of another one of his OffWhite collections. In this case, one that was called Natural Woman, but very much inspired by Princess Diana. And it came out around the time of the anniversary of her death. He was really interested, I think also because she was a people's princess and someone that was beloved by the people, came, not from most extravagant background, and became this princess and this, very appreciated and lauded person, but also a real fashion icon. And so this is another example, I think, where he was kind of tapping into a very particular kind of ethos and aesthetic and running it all the way through a whole fashion collection. And in this way, I also find him to be doing things that's quite similar to how an artist, a fine artist, might plan a gallery exhibition where, again, a certain theme is maybe played out across different paintings, sculptures, whatever, and he's kind of doing that in these very tightly curated fashion presentations, which, again, I don't see that happening as much in other fashion designers these days, where they might just be more inspired by a certain kind of color or something more ethereal or ephemeral in the air, but he's really going after, oftentimes, even kind of types of clothing that we wear, like business casual or casual Friday kinds of concepts and things like that. So there's, which again, really appeals to the art historian in me, but I guess also sells pretty well too. One place where some of his politics really became much more evident is in a fashion show that he did in Florence back in, let's see if I have the date on here, 2017. And this was a really big honor. He was invited to present at this fashion show that happens in June in Florence called Pitti Immagine, and it's kind of like a fashion award, and they give you a certain amount of money to produce a show. And so lots of the most well-known and most established and revered fashion designers have been given this award. And so Virgil got this in 2017, and he decided to work with the very political American artist Jenny Holzer, who uses words. Of course, Virgil also really likes playing with words. And this was around the time, too, that there was such a huge crisis in Europe with refugees fleeing Syria and other war-torn areas in the Middle East and coming to Europe, sometimes dying on the journey across the Mediterranean. And so a lot of the clothes really are kind of inspired and reference this sense of migration and emergency. And these texts were also taken from Jenny Holzer, and Virgil worked with poets from Syria in particular, and so they're really powerful poems about this struggle and this crisis. And so he really was kind of bringing this sort of sense of political awareness to the clothing, and again in a very, I think, concise kind of way. So the other thing that, again, I sort of mentioned before, this sort of political impetus that's in Virgil's work, and again, mostly having to do with race. And in our exhibition, when the concept really kind of came together, I think, and became really clarified after months and months, if not years, of kind of tinkering and playing with the concept, Virgil came up with this idea of the black gaze. And so in the Chicago presentation, there was a whole room that was called the Black Gaze, and part of it was really just to sort of, again, highlight this activist element that's in Virgil's work. And again, it's right there if you want to look for it. It's very easy to kind of be kind of distracted by his number of Instagram followers and the glamorous supermodels wearing his clothes and all the boutiques that he's selling this stuff in. But at the heart of so much of what he does is this sort of insistence on inclusion and access and equity. And you see it in the very first Louis Vuitton show that he did. He filled the ranks of the models with his friends from the worlds of hip hop and skateboarding. This is the rapper Playboi Carti coming down the runway at the very end of the show, wearing this kind of poncho that became quite iconic. He also has, in his association with Nike, designed clothes for Serena Williams that she was wearing at the French Open and at the US Open. So finding these really amazing platforms to kind of collaborate with well-known peers in other fields like Serena. In the show upstairs, there's a dress that he made for Beyonce that was supposed to be in the 2018 September issue of Vogue and ended up not making it into that issue, but that was also the issue that finally, for the very first time, featured a black photographer doing the cover image of that Vogue magazine, at Beyonce's insistence. So, and then here's another image from that first Louis Vuitton fashion show, which, like I said, all of the first models that came down the runway were all African American, and then eventually they started to kind of variegate in different ethnicities and races, and the clothing started to change from first all white into the colors of the rainbow. So there's a lot of this that you see in the work if you just sort of give a chance to take a look at it. The other place too, which he's really pushed, is with this gigantic global juggernaut, luxury juggernaut of Louis Vuitton. And it was in 2018 that he was named menswear designer for Louis Vuitton. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. And they gave the reins of this company, at least for the menswear section, to Virgil Abloh on the heels of the work that he was doing for OffWhite and the work that he started to do with Nike in 2017. And so you see Virgil still bringing some of these same ideas to bear on his work at Louis Vuitton. You see mannequins that he made specially for his collection that are all kids of color. Some of them, like the one on the left, are gigantic and are 50 to 60 feet tall sculptures that are kind of celebrating these young kids of color rather than boring, bland, anonymous, if not obviously Caucasian mannequins and models that you would usually find in the fashion industry. And doing really creative things and really pushing this company to do exciting projects like the one on the right, which is a pop-up store that he did on the Lower East Side of New York, the same neighborhood where he was kind of coming up with all of his generation of young creatives in the early 2000s. And so it's really interesting how I think how he's been able to push these big companies because they know that he's got this kind of magic touch and is able to garner interest and excitement for his work. And so he's really, really kind of pushing them. And I know at the MCA in Chicago, he really pushed us. I know he really pushed our friends at the High Museum. And so it's great to see him kind of taking this influence that he's earned and trying to kind of push the culture forward in some really powerful ways. Here's yet another example where, again, sort of taking all of the power that a company like Louis Vuitton has and using it to his own devices. He, of course, is a menswear designer, but for the very first Louis Vuitton campaign, he found a young female model whose parents were African immigrants and arrived in Paris and had her be the face of Louis Vuitton menswear for those first campaigns that came out. And so this is one of those iconic images. And some of these same messages have kind of come up in the OffWhite work as well. On the left-hand side, you see a neon sign that we have in the exhibition. And this was originally used in one of his OffWhite fashion shows. And it was taken from the movie Pretty Woman, where Julia Roberts is getting lots of attitude in this Beverly Hills fashion boutique. And the people there said, you obviously don't belong here, or you're obviously in the wrong place. And Virgil kind of took that and turned it around to also kind of reflect the feeling that he's had in this industry and being looked down upon or kind of shunned in a way and having to really fight for his place in the industry. And so this is another, I think, great example where Virgil's finding things in popular culture and manipulating them to kind of really respond and reflect what's going on today. Or this other picture on the right-hand side, which is another OffWhite fashion shoot, but these models are also African immigrant models. They're on the border, a border place between, I think in this case, France and Switzerland, and they're having to show their ID cards kind of to prove their legal status in Europe. And so these breadcrumbs of this kind of commentary are there if you're willing to look for it. The other, I really feel like this is a huge part of Virgil's work that's really important, that again, I don't think gets as much attention as it does. The other part, I think, that really makes him unique is this real modernist architectural training and background that he has. And this is an image of the famous Mies van der Rohe building in Chicago that he used to go to every day as an architecture student. And you can see it's just the utmost of purity, transparency. You know exactly where the walls are and the windows are and the floors are and the stairs and the relation to the ground. I mean, it's absolutely about transparency and clarity. And I think this real modernist sensibility guides so much of what Virgil does as well. At the same time he was going to school here, they also, however, just built a new Rem Koolhaas Student Center. And so Rem Koolhaas is the more postmodern version of Mies van der Rohe and represents another side, I think, of Virgil's design sensibility of disruption and kind of corruption and collage and borrowing from popular culture. And so those two things, I think, really combine in interesting ways throughout Virgil's work. I really see this already starting to show up in the work that he was doing for Kanye West and some of the packaging. And this album cover for the Yeezus album from 2013, I think, is totally Miesian in a way. Virgil stripped away everything that's unnecessary. There's no imagery, there's no text. All you have is a clear jewel box for the CD cover and this orange piece of tape that holds it together. And this design was so crucial for Virgil in his own story that you've seen upstairs. He turned it into a giant 5-foot-tall sculpture that's also all about this clarity. And you see that only the most necessary information for legal purposes and information purposes are printed on this. But otherwise, everything else has been stripped away. I also really see this in the shoes that he designed for Nike starting in 2010. He would figure out what the most crucial elements are of any of these iconic Nike shoe designs and kind of highlight those and make everything else kind of go away. And some of the ways that he did that he started cutting into these shoes and revealing where the crucial elements of the structure are that hold the shoe together, that carry the Nike logo. And in some cases, like with the Air Jordan there, the second one from the top, kind of making it look as if that Nike swoosh was just sort of sewn on there, or kind of tacked on there, so that you kind of start to recognize all the component parts that make an iconic shoe like that iconic. It's almost like a MFA architecture project where you're picking apart a building and figuring out all of its constituent parts and then putting it back together again, or diagramming them or something. There's something really analytical about this project that I think completely comes from his architecture training, and for me feels very Miesian, but at the same time there's that postmodern quality that you might find in Koolhaas, where the quotations come in, like the shoelaces are printed with, it says shoelaces in quotes on the shoelaces, or you see the air, where these patented air pockets would have been inside the soles of these shoes when they first started to come out. So again, this mix of hyper clarity, but then also kind of a winking, ironic quality. This idea of clarity, transparency, almost purity also is found in the DJ equipment that he designed for Pioneer, which we also have in the exhibition upstairs. He made all the casing clear so that all the wires and lights and mechanicals inside these DJ decks would be visible, and they would, of course, the lights and things change as these are being activated and played. It also shows up, I think, in the graphics that he makes for his DJ gigs, and on the right-hand side you see one of these posters or flyers that he makes. Mostly they go out online And there's this real clean, methodical kind of approach that he's made to these that always look recognizably Virgil, but then have the key information on there that tell you what's going on here. They usually have a flag of the country that he's performing in, something relating to the venue and the timing, and then oftentimes too he would include, in this case it's not so visible, but artworks that are inspiring him at that time. And then on the left is an image from one of his stage designs, and this is for his own DJing. And again, very simple, very stripped down. You see this upstairs too, this giant red wall that just has these quotations that kind of circulate through this screen. And in this case, this was Virgil DJing behind one of these screens. And all of this stuff is very much timed for and made for the Instagram age too. A lot of the slogans that come across this are perfect for if you're at this concert and you see him and it says, drink more water, or you're going to remember this tomorrow, or things like that. It's perfect for sort of rebroadcasting that message out into the world. And so Virgil, of course, is also a real master of that medium of social media. I don't know how many millions of followers he has at this point, but he really knows that medium very well. And in fact, when we were installing the exhibition in Chicago, he was really looking at the composition of objects in each room from thinking about an Instagram image and how that would translate back out into the digital world, which is the first time I've ever experienced that with an artist that I've worked with. And I thought that was really interesting from where he is today. He also, in terms of his architecture and his DJing and the other things that he works with, he's really a historian of everything that he gets into. And so as he was DJing and he was showing up in these different clubs around the world, he started to think about what the history of DJ and club architecture is. And he came across this architect called Ben Kelly, who you see on the left, who designed the famous Hacienda Club in Manchester, England. And Virgil looked up Ben Kelly and started a conversation and a friendship with him, and they started collaborating together. And so we have some sculptures upstairs in the exhibition that were a collaboration between the two of them, but also you see on the right-hand side this sort of temporary installation that they made that looks like a ruined club in a way. And of course, Ben Kelly was already using the industrial striping, industrial colors in his work, and of course, Virgil, as we know, also is really drawn to those kinds of motifs for the very same reasons. He also, in his architecture and design work, which is a growing and new field for him. The benches that you see here in the foreground, we showed for the very first time in June in Chicago. They just debuted in Paris last month, and are very high-tech concrete benches that are made out of hollow concrete mixed with some fiberglass and some other things that make them lighter than normal, but they also refer back to his days skateboarding. They're the perfect kinds of concrete leftover materials that you might find on the side of the road or at a construction site that kids would love to jump up on with their skateboards, maybe hang out there and leave some graffiti behind. And so this is, again, Virgil's, maybe his 17-year-old self and his 40-year-old sophisticated self kind of coming together in this new way. You also see in the background, too, this sculpture that we have here in the exhibition as well that looks like a Sunoco gasoline station sign. He's very fascinated with advertising and signage. Oops, I'm kind of jumping ahead to that topic. You'll see it later. But and which of course connects with his interest in Instagram and his skills in that area. But I think that's an area that he's starting to go into more and more these days. And then really briefly, I wanted to show you a couple images of some of his other furniture design interests. Here too you have him, this is the project that he started with IKEA, and his original idea was to take classic pieces of furniture from the 21st century and make them available to kids that are starting to make decorate their first apartments. But he, of course, like with Pyrex, hit up against all kinds of intellectual property rules and couldn't get the Le Corbusier rights and the Jean Prouvé rights, and so he started to kind of wrap these objects in string and in cloth and other things just to kind of mask their identity for the time being. And in this show upstairs, you'll see prototypes of these things that never made it into production because they weren't his to borrow and steal and use again. Here's an example of what that looks like upstairs. And I think also the work that he was doing for IKEA really has, a really playful, very art-inflected spirit to it. Then these quotations that he uses, words like "keep off" on a rug that you're meant to kind of walk on or sit on or put your chair or your table on, is really a contradictory and very similar, I think, to somebody like René Magritte in the early part of the 20th century, saying, here's a picture of a pipe, but this is not a pipe, and kind of creating these mental problems or puzzles in a way for us to work through. I'm just going to kind of skip ahead to some of these pieces like this, where, again, Virgil's using signage and interested in the piece on the left is an image of a billboard in a landscape, and he's really interested in billboards and had done some projects in Chicago with billboards, but usually they're black, and again, they don't carry a particular message. He's really just interested in the form of these things. One of the things that's also, of course, blossomed during the course of our work together over the last 3 years is working in the fine art field, making sculptures and paintings and photographs that don't have a function the way that his clothes do or his furniture does. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see where he goes with that. He hasn't even signed with a gallery yet, but he's already kind of very much thinking in this way, and working at the High here, working in Chicago at our MCA, is really kind of understanding how gallery spaces work, and I think it'll be really fascinating to see what he does. And you can see with projects like this, he's looking at masters like Calder, trying to figure out his own way forward through this tradition, so I think that's something that, again, is really promising. And then here, too, you see a really, and I'm sorry for my bad PowerPoint skills. I couldn't figure out how to make those curved corners disappear. The painting has rounded corners to it, but here I think you have all of these elements coming together. You have fashion with the cotton logo. You have, this is a painting on canvas, but then that really powerful message here, too, of sort of remind us where cotton comes from and the forced labor, the slavery history that's behind the cotton industry, and how we just take this for granted. And Virgil's really trying to kind of make us remember that, think about it, and again, in his own very subtle, very sophisticated way, I think, make us pay closer attention to the world around us. So that's my take on Virgil Abloh. I would be really happy to answer any questions that folks might have. And do we have a mic, Aaron, to pass around? Okay. Maybe if you have a question, we'll wait till we get the mic in your hand so that everybody can hear your question.
Hi, thanks for coming. I have two quick questions. One is, when I looked at the CD sculpture, it's misspelled. Was that an accident, or is it a joke, or was it just what?
What part of it was misspelled?
There's a word misspelled on the big CD.
On the
I'll
labeling
show it to you
on.
when you go upstairs, yeah.
Okay, I never noticed that. I wonder if it was an intentionally misspelled word, or if it really was some kind of a
I saw it when I first
typo.
came through, and then when I did a tour here at the High, the tour guide also was like, why is that misspelled?
Okay, I would love to come look at that with you afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
The second thing is, what's the connection to Joy Division, Heart and Soul? Is it because that record came out in 1980, or is there a deeper meaning, or does that have something to do with Ben Kelly and house music, or what?
I mean, I think I think Joy Division for sure was a band that Virgil really, really liked and responded to as a teen. That kind of angsty kind of quality of their music really appealed to him, even though he would have been coming to it, a second generation, really. And then, of course, he got really interested in the graphics that Peter Saville did for Joy Division, which, of course, then connects with Ben Kelly. So I think that's also Virgil as historian and archivist, and trying to figure out these connections between these people, peers, creative types that he really respects, and then in some cases finds a way to pay homage to them in his work.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you for your time and for speaking to us. And I just wanted to know, one of the things that you mentioned when talking about Off-White and the Black gaze was Virgil's insistence on inclusion, access, and equity. But when I think about Virgil Abloh as someone who is really invested in streetwear culture, I think about like how he has taken a lot of elements of the culture and amplified it. And now those things that used to be $200 at most are now selling for thousands of dollars, especially because he is the designer of Louis Vuitton, the male, like the male line. And so my question really is, what does access, equity, and inclusion mean to you? Because that's not what it means to me, as someone who can't afford to spend $1,000 on the culture anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question, and I think maybe is still the number one thing that I struggle with in thinking about and thinking through Virgil's work, which is the fact that these are also luxury items that cost so much money that normal people can't afford. And he's talked about kind of pricing them in such a way and showing them in Paris and making them in Milan, because that was the way to elevate this message and have it be kind of paid attention to. And yet then you kind of leave people behind at the same time. And the one area where I think he tries to address that is to make clothes, shoes in a way that we can like do it ourselves and make our own version of that. I mean, like kind of getting your own shoelaces and kind of, or cutting apart a regular Air Jordan or regular Air Force One. And I think you see people online doing that, kind of hacking these shoes and making their own versions of them or adding kind of Virgil-like twists to them. So I think, and this is where he wants to kind of almost like give you the cheat codes to go and make these types of statements yourself. And I think he's still borrowing from the language of T-shirts and flannels and things that we can, and like, work clothes like Carhartt type stuff. And so we can go out there, find this stuff cheap and kind of make our own versions of it. So I think that's sort of where he's coming from. But of course, it's hard to kind of have it both ways. You can't have this be like the designer of Louis Vuitton and still kind of make $5 stuff. I mean, so that's the ultimate, I think, conundrum in this whole situation. I think it's why the Nike collaboration is also important for him too. That those are $175 shoes if you can get in line first to get those shoes, or why IKEA was interesting for him too. So he tries to figure it out, but still I think it's the problem of the luxury world that he also operates in. Yeah. But
I just want to say thank you, for coming around and giving this whole huge presentation. I just want to know what you think, like Virgil's influence on DIY fashion culture for like the screen printing kids, and how he's been kind of the proprietor to like DIY fashion culture.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that we tried to accomplish in the book. Like, he wanted to kind of show his super humble beginnings and simple beginnings, and even just showing kind of some of these really early T-shirts. He doesn't want to obscure that part of his story, and he was, with his friends going off and making their own T-shirts or kind of doing hacks on kind of basic kind of normcore clothing to make them interesting. So I think that's still very much in his DNA, and then he's kind of somehow then taken it to the highest temple of fashion in Paris. And so I think that shift has also then opened the doors for other people that are also kind of his generation and were kind of raised on the same kind of ideas and impulses that are also starting to make big inroads in the high fashion world too. People like Heron Preston or Samuel Ross or others that were kind of part of their group, Matthew Williams and others. So So I think that's one way he's tried to do it, is like to open the door for these other folks. And mostly his friends, he's kind of trying to like say, here we are. I mean, that's sort of what that early picture of 2008 is like, here we are, we're ready to like take on this world, and whether you like it or not. And it's sort of taken a while for that to happen, but now I think it's really here.
Hello,
Hi.
my name's Ayan. Do you know if after he studied engineering and architecture, did he go into practice in those fields, or did he just go straight into his own production of his ideas?
Yeah, he hasn't told me too much about that period, but he was working for an architecture firm right there, kind of in his last sort of years or months, when he was finishing up architecture school, and when he was just starting to kind of dabble in some of the design stuff and do the Kanye stuff on the side. So he did have a day job at that point working in an architecture firm, but pretty soon thereafter he was able to find his way into Kanye's camp, I think, and kind of took it from there. So he hasn't really gone back and done any architectural practice since then. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I know that Virgil is evolving to the 40-year-old him, and I was just wondering if he had expressed any interest in his Ghanaian roots and how they play into anything that he wants to do in the future.
I don't know so much about where he might take that in the future, but he's definitely talked about it and thought about it. And I think he finds himself in that situation that I think sometimes is called like a third culture kid, where his parents are from Ghana, but he grew up in Chicago, and so when he goes back to Ghana, he doesn't speak the language, and he doesn't know the customs, and so he feels out of place there, but he's still, is proud of that. So I think he's struggled to figure out how to authentically kind of incorporate that into his work. There was a sculpture that he was thinking about for our exhibition, that included bringing soil and other things from Ghana and kind of making a sculpture of it. And it was a little too late in the game for us to figure out how to import soil from Africa without, and all of the, my friend from the CDC over here can tell us that would be a challenging thing to do, just, because of all the import stuff. So he's thought about it in a way, but I haven't seen any real work yet that reflects that Ghanaian heritage yet. So, but I think it could be very possible that he might do that in the future.
Thank you, Michael. Oh, you want one more? We'll take one more.
What do you think you personally are most impressed with from Virgil? If there is any one or two things that really kind of stand out for you when it comes to him?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, the one thing that kind of blows me away is his work ethic, and he just is working like all the time, and at a pace that is just kind of superhuman, and which he's slowed that down a little bit in the last half of a year or something like that, which hopefully is a good thing. But the other thing that really comes to mind is his interest in young people, and kind of trying to use his own story and his own career as an example for young people to look at and to follow, and to try to kind of, like he loves this idea of cheat codes, like to give as much of that information and be as transparent about that as possible so that other kids can go and do that. So I think he's always very generous with his time of trying to spend time with kids that are interested in fashion and music and things, and give them his own experiences. So that's the part that I love about what he does, that he hasn't just like forgotten about where he came from and that 17-year-old self. And he always wants to make time for that and kind of try to stay connected to that energy in a way. And the thing that I saw, I don't know, I haven't talked to my High Museum friends about this, but the thing that I was blown away by in Chicago is how many really young people were coming to that show, like like 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds that were dragging their parents to a museum to come to lectures like this and to see this exhibition. And so that you can kind of tell that he is inspiring to that younger generation. And I think that's the thing that I think is most impressive about what he's done. Sure.
Thank you so
Okay.
much for coming.
Thank you.